mobile security absolutely has to fit within a bank's overall cybersecurity strategies. Today, I think that most banks realize the fact that a lot of their customers are increasingly adopting mobile platforms, and banks are subject to regulatory mandates and supervision. And therefore, from a cybersecurity standpoint, they also have to comply with those regulations. So there's pressure on both sides. One, expectations from the consumers who are more tech savvy, and one from the regulators who want to make sure that cybersecurity strategies reflect all of the necessary data security, data privacy issues that might be confronting consumers in retail banking or other forms of financial services. In order for security to be adopted and successfully deployed, it has to be unobtrusive and idiot resistant. So if it's too difficult to use, people are not going to use it, and they're going to want to opt out, etc. So that's where you can only force people to go and do so many things. And then there's education to encourage them to go to the next level of security in terms of how they themselves behave, configure their applications, set up their alarms, their alerts, etc. That last layer, I think, is one that is more related to the bank itself for protecting the bank's brand, the bank's reputation, the bank's image, because regardless of how a consumer may have been compromised, they are most likely going to turn around to the bank and assume that it's the bank's fault and that it's the bank's security that failed. And so that client experience is not good for the relationship, and it's not good for public relations in general. And if it's something that relates to a series of issues regarding to fraud with multiple customers, then it becomes not only a security disaster, but it becomes a public relations disaster and potentially a financial disaster in terms of how it might affect confidence in the financial institution and its stock valuation. And we see that every time there's a bank scandal relating to something, the stock price varies. So banks can be very sensitive to that, but not necessarily for the reasons that one might think. They're trying to balance everything between the cost of doing business and some acceptable level of loss, and then managing reputation and brand on the other end. And when the threat level increases to a point where it is beyond what is acceptable in terms of losses, then that's where the banks get animated and get excited and start looking for new solutions and new technologies. Wow, that's a good question. Mobile banking security from the consumer perspective is particularly challenging because there are some consumers who are, I'll say, tech savvy, but the vast majority of consumers are not. So they're taking it for granted that the apps that they're using are going to be secure. And to some extent, they are quite naive, which is why the banks are somewhat concerned, because there are some regulatory mandates, some security parameters that have been imposed on the banks and that keep evolving with other digital platforms. And they have to go about implementing those in a way that is the least intrusive to the consumer. So it has to be as invisible as possible. And so the consumer expects that if nothing's going on, if they're not doing anything special from a security standpoint, that the bank has them covered. And so I think that consumer education or self-education would be very important in terms of making sure that consumers are on the same level of understanding with regards to cybersecurity, that the bank can't cover everything. The consumer has some responsibility of using what the bank has to offer in terms of alarms, notifications, the ability to block the card with the mobile application, etc. If consumers don't use those features, then the bank's approach might be technologically successful, but might not be a successful deployment in the real world. Well, the banks are trying everything that they get their hands on or get wind of. They obviously can't do everything. So the first thing is basically making sure that people click all the right parts in the application in terms of liability and responsibility, etc. So that's, I'd say, that the first thing the banks do is let's figure out how to protect ourselves, actually. And then let's tell our customers all the things that we are supposed to disclose. So the disclosures in the application. So none of that is particularly sophisticated technology. It's just about building into the application any of the boilerplate language that you would have if you were opening an account at a branch. So that's pretty much covered. But what is missing still is a consistency between the different banks as to how they deal with security and multi-factor authentication. And it can change from application to application. And with regards to contactless payments within the mobile applications as well, there may be differences. Some banks will use NFC technology. Some banks will use QR code. You might even think about using ultrasound. So there's a little bit I would say, experimentation taking place in the marketplace in terms of looking at technologies for securing the application from liabilities and contractual standpoint, securing the application in terms of how it is configured in terms of the features and functionality in the application that people will use alerts and notifications, etc. And then the third part is anything that has to do with multi-factor authentication in terms of validating that the user who's using the application on that device or using that device to even interface with a third device, like a mobile application for a mobile cash withdrawal at an ATM without a card, all of that has to be very well integrated. And today, it's not as well integrated as it could be. And I think that they're looking at other technologies in that respect. Yes, I think there's some banks that are doing better than others in terms of how they're deploying security. And I would say that all of the major banks today offer multi-factor authentication, leveraging both mobile devices and the online platform, and they either the mobile application or a texting using a one-time PIN. But even one-time PIN has some issues. So now the technology is going more towards industry-based security solutions like authenticator type apps, etc. So the banks are keep adjusting. I think they realize that right now security is now going to become a major ongoing operational reality. It's no longer something that's kind of nice to have, etc., because the risks now are very real for the bank. As more and more people are using digital platforms, that's where crime is going to migrate. Robbing a bank with guns is not efficient. Robbing a bank digitally, whether you're attacking the bank itself or attacking the consumers through the consumer platforms, is where the challenge is today. I think one of the things that has to do with mobile security that comes up a lot is what are the people who are working on the application security front doing? And it may be industry vertical specific. And then what are the phone manufacturers and designers doing? Because it's also somewhat dependent to the extent of what generation of phone will support what type of method. So if you're talking about biometric recognition between fingerprint or facial recognition, and even with newer technology, the ability to do iris recognition at some point in time, the technology already exists. It's a matter of miniaturization. So I think what you're going to see is you're going to see a tightening of the integration between these types of device-specific capabilities and the application providers in terms of improving security in layers that are less obtrusive. Because if the phone recognizes both your fingerprint and your face as a form of multi-factor authentication, I'm just using that as an example, then that adds a layer of security that can be very useful. On the other hand, you want to make sure that if you're going to deploy those technologies, that they are reliable and consistent, because if they do not work and it's a false negative and the consumer is not recognized, that's a bad client experience. So I'm less concerned from a security standpoint about false positives than I am about parameters that would be too tight, because people might be slightly inconsistent. So they might not look at the camera out of the same angle, or put their fingerprint exactly the same way and whatever. So by layering those methods, plus alternate methods of using geolocation on the phone and application security, you can build in a security ecosystem that operates in the background that is invisible to the consumer. And I think ultimately that's where the technology is going to tend towards. It's basically make the security automatic within the application configuration, and the application configuration on devices with specific characteristics, features, or capabilities.